Our second speaker is Professor Joshua Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell is currently a professor of political theory at Georgetown University. He's also a Washington Fellow at the Claremont Institute Center for the American Way of Life. Professor Mitchell teaches courses on great works of political philosophy, including a class on Plato's Republic and another on Tocqueville's Democracy in America. On a personal note, Professor Mitchell was one of my teachers at Georgetown many years ago, and I learned a great deal from him, and I'm grateful for his example both as a teacher and a scholar. His most recent book, published last fall, is titled American Awakening: Identity Politics and Other Afflictions of Our Time. The title of his talk this morning is 2021, the Year of the Scapegoat. Please join me in welcoming Professor Joshua Mitchell.
Morning. The American regime, threatened throughout much of the 20th century by communism abroad and hobbled at home by progressives seeking to dismantle the constitutional order that the founders framed, now face a far greater challenge, its gravest since 1865. The combined kinetic force of the greatest military in history of the world cannot defend against its onslaught. The nature of this threat is not material, it's spiritual. It is domestic rather than foreign. One portion of America is captivated by its promise of spiritual purification. Another portion, knowing that such a world is not possible this side of heaven, is repelled by the hellish dystopian path we are now forced to walk to get there. Over these differing visions, neighbor is set against neighbor, wife against husband, sister against brother. Civil war a century and a half ago saw 1 in 45 Americans perish. So deep was its wound that no successive generation found cause to resume its carnage. What was unthinkable yesterday is today quietly whispered. Defenders of the new spiritual menace declare that whites and people of color in America are irreconcilably opposed tribes, the one stained and the other pure. The truth is otherwise. America is now two distinct species, each an amalgamation of many races, resolved unto death to live in different regimes, each toxic to the other, whispering the unthinkable. Intending to ward off the threat to the constitutional regime the founders set in place in 1790, the old-line liberals and conservatives have marshaled their rhetorical weapons. We stand opposed to progressivism and the methods of cultural Marxism. We will defend family values and religious liberty. We categorically reject socialism. We are pro-life. We believe in free markets and lower taxes. And have found them useful for gathering supplies and building a comfortable encampment, but ineffective against a new enemy on the battlefront. Provisions are surely needed, but victory cannot be won without weapons appropriate for the current war being waged. What is the grave threat we now face? The most succinct formulation, easy to understand once the larger framework within which it achieves coherence is grasped, is this: we are living amidst a great new American awakening, this time without God and without forgiveness. What does this mean? Consider the First Great Awakening and its emblematic 1741 Jonathan Edwards sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Man, tainted by sin, can only be saved by Christ, the sacrificial lamb who takes away the sins of the world, 1 John 1:29. Moral cleanliness and purity are unachievable by moral effort alone. Everything this side of heaven is impure. Because uncleanliness cannot cleanse itself, only Christ, the divine eruption, who is without spot or blemish, 1 Peter 1:19, can atone for man's uncleanliness, and save him from the eternal fires of hell to which his uncleanliness condemns him. The contemporary iteration of that sermon variants of which are preached daily across America by the new elect, might be called, and this is not my term, irredeemables in the hands of an angry mob. This sermon is a ghastly distortion of the version Edwards preached in 1741. Then in Puritan America, as now, man's stain is the consuming issue. In this contemporary sermon, moral cleanliness and purity is not purchased by the scapegoating of Christ at Calvary, but rather by scapegoating another person or human group said to be responsible for the sins of the world. The new elect declare, not all mankind is unclean, just the white race. All others gathered together under the category of people of color are in fact clean. Let us establish who the unclean ones are and purge them from our midst. If you happen to be white, all you must do is convince yourself and everyone else that not you, but those other white people are filthy and irredeemable. They must pay eternally so that we may show ourselves to be clean. So declare the new elect. In this new awakening, cathartic rage must be directed toward the wrong kind of white man, his group, and all that he has wrought in human history. Through this cleansing of cathartic rage, America can be purified, its toxin purged from the social body. Cast one man or his group into the eternal fires of hell so that the others can be saved. If thy right hand offend thee, cut it off. The new elect are deeply offended. How do these two American awakenings differ with respect to how they understand debt and payment? In the first Great Awakening, God's grace and forgiveness were understood to be the proper means to heal man, cover over his filth, and repay a debt owed to God that man could not pay. A divine gift alone cleansed the world and paid off man's debt, so that tomorrow might be lived with a clean ledger. The audacious wager of the current American awakening is that Christ's blood sacrifice was and is unnecessary, indeed an embarrassment no one in good company need talk about. There are no gifts for which we should be thankful, no payment made on our behalf, no mercy that we must extend to others because it has been divinely extended to us, no promissory note of, say, the sort Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King had in mind, which can be paid off in full in the future if we live and act in good faith. Hope, faith, and charity are foolishness. Equity, by which we really mean retribution, is the order of the day. Equity is the never-ending reminder to the irredeemables that their tomorrow can never be lived with a clean ledger. We must think clearly about where culpability lies in these two strangely related frameworks. For the Christian, for Jonathan Edwards, the convenient lie man tells himself is that he is innocent. The very first words uttered by Adam in Genesis 3:12, reveal a creature who hides from his culpability. In the beginning, we might say, was the narcissist. Look not to me, I am innocent, fault lies elsewhere. Do not disturb my good image of myself. Catastrophe then follows upon catastrophe. The Bible is its chronicle. God brings the law for Jews and the gospel for Christians to rescue the heirs of Adam from the death-spiraling narcissism evident in the very first words Adam utters. The law and the gospel are irrelevant in the new American awakening, and we must understand why. Like the first Great Awakening, the point of departure for the new American awakening is Adam's declaration, I am innocent. Instead of seeing this as a ruse and attributing culpability to everyone without exception, its adherents divide the world along racial lines into those who are innocent and those who are not. Because there is no universal uncleanliness, neither the law nor the gospel are needed to solve the real systemic problem of man. The Adam and Eve of today's Great Awakening believe they are innocent and without spot, that the poisonous serpents all around them are the culpable ones, and that the oppressive world created by whiteness from which they now suffer, capitalist, nation-state-centric, patriarchal, dirty fossil fuel use, etc., is the source of the anxiousness that assaults them like a hostile external force they cannot appease. The law and the gospel are answers to the universal catastrophe of Adam's culpability and lost innocence. The new American awakening denies the universality of sin and denies that all of us live in a post-Edenic world. It therefore denies the need for the atonement offered by the law and the gospel. We have to catalog the scattered array of phenomena that thoughtful citizens today witness and decry, but cannot yet integrate into a comprehensive framework. Critics of the New Awakening have names for many of the ritual enactments, some in jest, some serious. What is needed is terminology that links all of these phenomena together so that the true nature of the threat of the New American Awakening poses can be clearly discerned. First, consider the purge words invoked daily to mark and shame the irredeemables: hater, denier, fascist, Nazi, Islamophobe, transphobe, misogynist, homophobe, authoritarian, and more recently, insurrectionist. These words carry with them the power to banish and to exile. That is their intended effect. Once they have been uttered, the comportment of both the accuser and the accused visibly changes. The accuser beams with the iridescent light of discharged rage. The accused slinks into the darkness, shamed by the leprosy of his irredeemable sin. The unbridgeable chasm, or rather an unbridgeable chasm, between the two has opened up. They stand on opposite sides of an impenetrable border wall within a community, of which they were both members a few short minutes ago. Defenders of the New American Awakening declare that visible borders between nations should be abolished. Borders are exclusionary. Abolish borders in one place, however, and they will emerge in another. The New American Awakening establishes an invisible border between the pure and the stained. I am clean, you are filthy. This is not the politics as the founders had envisioned it. This is an attempt to establish a new kind of politics, a politics not of competing interests through which we build a world together, but a politics of utopian purity in which the wheat and the tares are separated before the harvest. Second, we should consider the phenomena of cancel culture. One day you are a citizen, the next day, having said or written something declared heretical by the Church of the New American Awakening, you become, as Tocqueville wrote in Democracy in America, a stranger among us. The sum total of your contribution to society, the wealth of competence you have demonstrated, these suddenly count as nothing. In the ledger book of cancel culture, your assets cannot possibly pay for your transgression, nor can you buy your way back into society with an apology or a promise to repent. As with original sin in Christianity, you are now burdened with a debt that is beyond measure, which you yourself can never repay, no matter how substantial your assets. The New American Awakening rules out the gospel good news the First American Awakening offered, namely that Christ will pay off your unpayable debt. There is no gospel good news for the canceled in the New American Awakening. However far it has defected from its original purpose, the aptly named penitentiary system was an organized attempt to provide prisoners with more than just an opportunity to pay off their debt to society. Through Christian penance, their stain would be wholly removed. In the New American Awakening, those who are canceled are banished from society no less than are today's prisoners, though without any chance of removing the stain that now blots their reputation. There will always be prisoners. The new elect wish to grant clemency to one group of prisoners and permanently incarcerate another. The new elect are quick to invoke the God of love when it comes to prisoners and, say, illegal aliens, who in their mind are cruelly stigmatized. Yet when it comes to those who the new elect cancel, the God of judgment makes a sudden appearance. Cancel culture is the dark interior of the New American Awakening, which claims to be guided solely by the God of love until its all-loving parishioners turn into an angry mob and elicit the God of judgment to purge the irredeemables. Third, consider virtue signaling. The phenomena is quite misnamed, which precludes us from understanding it. Virtue is of Greek philosophical origin. Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics is the most noble formulation. What we witness today in the New American Awakening is not feigned virtue. It is a frantic attempt to convey innocence in a world suffused by guilt in the hope that social death will pass over. This phenomenon is of biblical rather than Greek philosophical origin. For the Christian, the Passover ritual is Easter, the somber Good Friday of sacrifice in which Christ's innocent blood is shed for the many for the remission of sins, Matthew 26:28, is followed on Easter Sunday by the resurrected Christ, whose victory over death is imputed to man, so that the curse of death, occasioned by his sin, no longer befalls him. It's the Jewish Passover ritual, however, that most clearly reveals the template for the innocent signaling that we see today everywhere. In the Hebrew Bible, Exodus 12:23, God's deadly wrath passes over those Jewish homes on whose doorframe has been painted the innocent blood of a sacrificed lamb. The public visibility of that marker of innocence saves them from death. All the rest perish. This is the lesson about who lives and who dies, and about how death, in this case social death, can be kept at bay. This lesson is reenacted daily across America. All too many Americans, not knowing how to discharge their guilt, today reflexively commit themselves to the cause of, quote, social justice, say by painting BLM in large letters on the street in front of their house. Are they not thereby absolved of the charge of being racist? Does not social death pass over their houses because those letters stand for the innocent blood of the sacrificed lamb, the death of George Floyd, for example, in America? Across America today, citizens are transfixed on signaling their innocence. After they do so, and social death passes over, all too many of them return to inaction and slumber, content that they need not do anything more to address the real afflictions of the least among us. The new American awakening has given us the frenetic moral posturing of innocent signaling that momentarily lifts the weight of guilt, but does none of the long-term heavy lifting needed to solve the real problems of real people. Fourth, there's the much-mocked phenomena of wokeness. On the face of it, wokeness is indistinguishable from innocent signaling. The person who is woke is signaling his innocence. But wokeness, as the name implies, pertains to awakening. From what do the woke awaken? They awaken from the slumber associated with the unexamined prejudices that purportedly inhere in all the institutions in which they dwell. The woke, therefore, must transform those institutions, must rename them, in fact. For the woke, for example, churches and universities are referred to as communities. If you are greeted at the door with, "Welcome to our community," you can be certain that the institution you're about to join has deliberately turned away from its proper purview. A woke church, for example, will be at pains to distance itself from those passages in the Bible that make its parishioners uncomfortable, a signal word in the vocabulary. It will claim that the sum total of Christianity is social justice, will be at pains to explain away Christ's words, "The poor will always be with you." For the difficult revolutionary inner reorientation of the soul towards God that Christ announced has been substituted the outer social revolution Christ's betrayer, Judas Iscariot, desired. The woke university will be at pains to distance itself from the time-honored mission of truth-seeking that will be necessarily at odds with the prevailing prejudices of the age. Turn a university into a community, and it is transposed into an institution that reinforces the prejudices of the community. The longing for the good, the true, and the beautiful in Plato, penetrating reflections about nobility and wonder in Aristotle, the mystery of the soul in God in Augustine, these authors and a handful of others, once-in-a-thousand-year giants who invite us to explore the unknown territory beyond the borders of our prejudices. In the hands of the woke, these people are purveyors of prejudice, Western prejudice, white prejudice, from which we must now awaken. The task of the woke university is to teach the Articles of Confession of the Church of the New American Awakening. Everything else is archaic flourish, soon to be chiseled away. While not yet forced to do so, professors, administrators, and students in colleges and universities across our country today are expected to bow before the golden calf of the woke university community that has been fashioned. Woe unto the heretic who refuses community membership. What of woke capitalism? These developments have caught defenders of the free market quite off guard. When the enemy abroad was communism and the threat within was progressivism, conservatives and defenders of the free market made common cause. Together they endorsed the constitutional republic whose vibrancy was assured by family, religious liberty, and by entrepreneurship. The free market entrepreneur, as we know, must attend to the ledger book that records profit and loss. There are many important things he must attend to, but if for long he fails to attend to that ledger book, his business fails. The Church of the New Awakening presents the entrepreneur with another ledger book, one that registers guilt and innocence, and demands that he succeed by its measure or suffer social death. In order to be profitable now in the double sense, money must be made and innocence must be signaled. Under the banner of corporate social responsibility, woke capitalism today funnels vast sums of money to so-called social justice causes that purchase their innocence. To be a legitimate business enterprise in America today, earning a profit is not enough. You must prove you are not a racist, not a denier, etc. To these observations should be added once more. The largest and most profitable business enterprises on the planet have discovered that in order to avoid scrutiny to which they would otherwise be subject, they need only signal their innocence in the ledger book that the New American Awakening provides. Should we then be really surprised to learn, for example, that BlackRock, the world's largest asset management firm, which oversees $7 trillion of assets, is a leading advocate of corporate social responsibility? In what sort of world is it acceptable for a business enterprise to have that much power? The basic tenet of market commerce certainly disallows it. Answer: in the woke capitalist world in which innocence signaling in one domain buys you an exemption from scrutiny in another, parishioners in the Church of the New American Awakening have become fabulously wealthy and even actively seek to destroy their competition, provided they can find the cover of social death. That is what the Democratic Party, the party of the innocence signaling, provides them, which is why the Democratic Party has become the party of the super rich. It says to them, "Come unto me, all of you who are heavily burdened with wealth, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28. I suspect we will soon see a Republican Party that for the last century had the interest of big business in mind, will abandon woke capitalism and back the American worker instead. The fifth phenomenon that requires a comprehensive account is whimsically called TDS, or Trump Derangement Syndrome. Now, I fully understand the strong distaste that Trump can arise. And on political grounds and on cultural grounds and social grounds, there are many reasons one can oppose him, but there's something else going on here with TDS, or Trump Derangement Syndrome. TDS is not incidental to the American Awakening. It is a central feature, confirmed by the cathartic rage its parishioners exhibit toward former President Trump or those who voted for him. At the mention of his name, rational conversation ceases, and purge words, see above, spew forth, not with the view to enriching conversation, but with the view to terminating one conversation and beginning another, perfectly rational in character, in which President Trump does not even exist. We do not need to be a penetrating social critic today to notice that there are two conversations happening in America, one that can include Trump and another one that simply cannot. We say America is politically polarized, but that only scratches the surface. Something much more fundamental than politics is being worked out here, and we need to get at it. TDS is actually not the issue, but it helps us pose the issue, and here it is. What is the relationship between rational conversation and cathartic rage? Pressing the question further, might the precondition for rational conversation be the successful discharge of cathartic rage toward a sacrificial offering? This idea is discomforting to the modern mind, for whom sacrifice is a barbarous relic of pre-modernity. Christianity, we must never forget, is pre-modern, or rather, it's the fulcrum that separates the pre-modern from the modern. The interminable blood sacrifice in which the rage of the community was discharged on a victim in the pre-modern world was brought to a close by the Christian affirmation that Christ is the one sufficient sacrifice, Hebrews 10:10-14, after which no further blood sacrifice was necessary. The very success of Christianity, in a word, is the cause of the modern incredulity and unease about sacrificial offering. Man could be reasonable because the need for ongoing cathartic rage toward the victim had come to an end. This insight allows us to make sense of Augustine's remark in The City of God that Christ freed man from the oppressive domination of demonic powers. This was Locke's claim as well in The Reasonableness of Christianity. The precondition for the Enlightenment was Christ's sacrificial offering. The Church of the New American Awakening walks back this astonishing achievement. Here, the clearing of reason, to coin a phrase, shrinks and is intermittently intertangled and overwhelmed by the cathartic rage toward a mortal sacrificial offering. When the one sufficient sacrifice of Christianity is replaced by the mortal scapegoat who must again and again be offered up as an object of cathartic rage, we witness a strange but predictable oscillation in those who suffer from TDS between moments of exemplary lucidity and moments of venomous irrationality. Nothing more characterizes TDS than this entanglement and oscillation. For those who suffer from TDS, the clearing of reason, like a sunny clearing in a dense, ever-encroaching jungle, must be carved out each day anew. Hence, both the revulsion toward and pathological 24/7 need to track and register everything President Trump said or did so that the rage may be discharged. TDS may wane in former President Trump as he withdraws from political office. What will not wane is the entanglement of reason and cathartic rage, the consequence of which is there can only be two kinds of conversations in America today. One that legitimately includes Trump without the discharge of rage, and another one that cannot. It's difficult to imagine how a political consensus, so necessary if we are to find workable domestic policies and face foreign threats abroad, can be forged under these circumstances. There's much more to say. I simply want to raise one more question about microaggressions. Everybody is guilty of microaggressions, so says the new elect. If you have any Christian sensibility at all, you know what the origin of microaggressions is. It's the idea that each morning we have to wake up and ask the question, am I culpable for something that I don't even know I've done? One could argue that it goes back to the origin of the idea of original sin in Christianity. Microaggressions, like so much else in the New Awakening, is simply a watered down and deeply destructive perversion of Christianity. So I've got a couple minutes left. I want to raise a question. Why not view these phenomena under the category of cultural Marxism, progressivism, or multiculturalism? And I raise this because my view is we now must achieve a razor-like focus on the threat here, draw all these phenomena together, and eschew old answers that are not working that conservatives have offered. Namely, this is a problem of multiculturalism, a problem of cultural Marxism, and a problem of progressivism. Look, the progressives, I don't like the project, but it was a project which intended to replace citizen competence with expert competence. That's not what's going on now. We're not looking for expert competence on the left. We're looking for elite purity on the left. That's not progressivism. It's changed. Second, multiculturalism. I'm enough of a liberal to believe that multiculturalism in and of itself is not a terrible thing. If we want to have visibility, that's what pluralism suggests we should be aiming for. And America is a pluralistic society, so visibility is a fine thing. The problem, though, is that what's happened now is not multiculturalism at all. Instead of looking at plurality from the framework of the rule and the exception, let's say a pluralistic society is one in which we have a general set of understandings about how we're to proceed, family, church is intact, and then we can be large-minded enough to let other things in. That's pluralism. But that's not what's happening with today's brand of identity politics. What's happening is that the exception has become the rule. So if you press the transgendered argument far enough, you hear people saying that people who aren't supportive of the transgender movement are guilty of heteronormativity and supporting a homophobic church. You can't build society on the basis of the exception becoming the rule. And I think this is one of the problems. Last, cultural Marxism. This, I think, is very important for us to understand. On the right, we have talked for a long time about how cultural Marxism has made a long slog through the institutions of America. And there is a reason why it was a long, slow slog. Because as Lewis Hartz demonstrated as early as 1955 in a book you should all own called The Liberal Tradition in America, the very categories that Marx uses are anathema to America. Class, in the sense that's understood in Europe, and property. They simply aren't going to work. And so Marxism, Hartz declared in 1955, could never penetrate. Nevertheless, through cultural Marxism, there was a long, slow march to the institutions. That is not what is happening with the New American Awakening. Every single day, our institutions are begging the church of the new elect to give them sanction, to give them innocence cover. There is no long, slow march through the institutions with identity politics. It is happening instantaneously. And in my view, and here I'll close on these remarks, unless the churches awaken, and understand that the categories of transgression and innocence are ones that they own fully. And unless the churches recover the full depth of their understanding of how one addresses innocence and transgression, I don't think we're going to make it. I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Professor Mitchell. I'm guessing your talk will provoke some questions. Do we have any?
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Mitchell. I was just wondering, when you talk about the assimilation of kind of Christian morals to form this new ethic.
Could you speak up a bit?
When you discuss kind of the assimilation of Christian morals to form a new ethic, and we're dealing with these residual categories, why hasn't forgiveness been able to make that leap?
Well, let me give you the larger picture in my view, and I raised this in the book and I haven't raised it here. Nietzsche, who I'm not a huge fan of, nevertheless had a pretty powerful diagnosis of the problem the West would face. And in a famous passage, which some of you probably even know, in the Genealogy of Morals, he said, "It's the church and not its poison that offends us." And what he meant by that was that we moderns would be turning away from the church and the whole apparatus of the church, but we would retain what he called its poison, by which he meant equality, democracy, the idea of dignity of persons. He doesn't say this, but the category of the innocent one, which is the central category of the New Awakening, the innocent victim. That is a Christian category. I hope we understand this, right? So Nietzsche's diagnosis in 1880 or thereabouts was that the future of the West would take this form. Much of the trappings of Christianity would carry forward, but not the overall architecture. And so, idea of equality, the idea of the innocent victim, the idea of innocence and transgression, the idea of sin, though dissevered from its deeper theological roots, these things would carry forward. But the overall architecture would be left behind. So we would lose atonement, repentance, forgiveness, things like this. And this is the problem, is that the category of innocence and transgression is a very, very deep category. It precedes Christianity. Right? The oldest tablet we have is the Code of Hammurabi, a code of transgressions and payments. The first person that has a conversation with Socrates in the Republic is Cephalus, and he offers up the first definition of justice, which is justice is debt, payment, and he's haunted by debt. So you've got these categories that are still with us, and yet the church, which gave man a way to have a tomorrow, no longer is there. And what do I mean by have a tomorrow? Well, in Nietzsche's second essay in the Genealogy of Morals, he asked this question: how can we have a tomorrow? And his answer was, well, the Christians, those silly Christians, thought that you have a tomorrow through forgiveness, atonement, and repentance. And that was so necessary because if original sin, however strong or weak you have it in mind, if it's intact, then you're going to eventually build up a weight that you can't discharge. That's the meaning of the good news, the gospel good news, is that we're involved in a creation which turns toward darkness, or we rather turn toward darkness, and there's the eternal gift and mercy that's shown to us, forgiveness that's shown to us. And that's how you have a tomorrow. And Nietzsche said, well, if God is dead, then what? How do we have a tomorrow? And in the Church of the New Awakening, there are a whole group of people who will never have a tomorrow because they bear this weight from which they can never be released. And that's why in America today, people are throwing off monuments, throwing off their history, because the only way you can find atonement in the Church of the New American Awakening is to renounce all those occasions where you could be identified with sin. So we have to throw off the American founding, we have to throw out all the monuments, and in Europe you've got this similar catastrophe, though not based on racism, but based on colonialism and the two world wars, all of which were fomented by nations. And so the wager you get in Europe now is the way that you can the way you can have a tomorrow that's not heavy is to renounce your nation. That's the only way. There is no Christian forgiveness. There is no atonement. There is no repentance. And that's the problem. That's why I say we're going to lose this, because the only way out within this new framework is you have to renounce every historical institution that you remain affiliated with, or maybe even renounce your race. You have to renounce everything so that you can have spiritual purity. And the great Christian insight is there is no spiritual purity. We start out each day with a kind of brokenness, and we have a foothold on faith, and these institutions are given to us, and let us recognize them as precious, but also broken. And so each and every day we have to do what we can to build a world, knowing that God will at the end redeem the world, and only then will the wheat and the tares be separated. So you've got this horrendous situation where a lot of the Christian terminology is being carried forward, but without the churches. And without that, there's no redemption. And if there's no redemption, you will renounce everything that is associated with stain, everything. That's why this is the most pernicious threat since 1865, since the Civil War. It will destroy this country. And only the reawakening of Christianity will save us from this.
He wants to know, with the proliferation of various identities based on race, class, gender, and now apparently a secular division between the innocent and guilty, it seems that these various factions would be destined for conflict when their interests do not coincide, or simply when they offend each other. Is there a political apparatus that now gives, or will give, these groups coherence?
What was the last word? Give these groups?
Coherence.
I can get to most of the question. So first, there's a confusion about the term identity. There's two usages. One is it refers to a kind. 30 years ago, the oldsters in the room can remember this. We didn't say I have an American identity. We said I'm an American. And now identity is the suffix onto everything. And so my strongest recommendation, first of all, would be that you completely jettison the word identity. You can just say you're an American, or you're a man, or you're a woman, or whatever you are. You just say that. You don't have to use the word identity. It's playing to a pathology I think we need to overcome, which is to say everybody has to have an identity to count. Quickly, I have taught in the Middle East for half of the last 15 years. And one day, a fully covered Muslim woman came into my office after a class she had been to, taught by another professor. She said, "Professor Mitchell, why do I have to have an identity? All your professors are telling me I have an identity. I'm just a Muslim. Why do I have to have an identity?" It was very revealing. Identity is an attempt to, by the left, I think, to try to comprehend every possible difference. And my argument against identity is that you're trying to subsume all difference within one set of categories. But if you're really interested in being attentive to a plural world, you will, especially if you're in another country, you'll just shut up and listen and see how people think of themselves, rather than saying, oh, you have this identity, you have that identity. So identity is kind. I'm not so troubled by it. There are some problems. But that's not how we're using identity today. We're using identity as relationship. We are specifying our distance from the prime transgressor, who is, for the moment, the white heterosexual male. Full disclosure, I have no interest in defending racial politics. I hope you understand this. I'm just saying that there's a theodicy here that's being offered up that's a deep perversion of Christianity. Identity politics does understand that there needs to be a scapegoat. I get this. Okay, this is important. Identity politics is a distortion of Christianity. That's what we have to see. And the question is, what's the sufficient scapegoat? And the wager identity politics is currently making is, here's the scapegoat, it's the white heterosexual male. But once he gets purged, there will be others. And I think the next one is going to be white women, hence the Karen meme, which some of you already know about. And I think the one after that's going to be black heterosexual men. But because you always have to have an imminent scapegoat. Finally, where might there be some hope? Well, that's to say hope that this thing is not going to go on forever. As you move farther out, in this project of discovering heretofore innocent and invisible ones. As you move farther out, what happens is the way that you can make these visible is you have to make these ones here more problematic. So if you move into the transgender moment, then you're going to raise the question of whether male and female are categories, legitimate categories. Now, when you do that, a lot of feminists and gay men are going to say, no, they are legitimate categories. We just choose to be among one side or the other. It's not conventional. And then the most interesting one of all, in my view, is what happens to Black America. Because the overall argument has been civil rights goes to women's rights, goes to gay rights, goes to transgender rights. But as you get out here and you begin to doubt whether the very category of male and female are adequate or whether the church is adequate, then you start running up against much of Black America. Let's just use Martin Luther King as an example. I mean, he understood that the family, the conventional generative family, and the churches as conventionally understood were the things that were most important to Black America. So how is it that as you keep moving out, you end up going after earlier innocent victims who then become transgressors? So Martina Navratilova, for example, the feminist, or J.K. Rowling, defending female as a distinct category. Now they're attacked. So feminists are now getting attacked. So the farther out you go, the groups that were once opposed to the conventional world then become lumped in with the conventional world. And I think that's one of the reasons why it will eventually implode. I don't think we should stick around and just wait for it, though. I think we have to return. We have to make very clear that what is going on here is scapegoating, and that there's two ways to scapegoat. You can scapegoat the Christ, who's the one sufficient sacrifice, and so you have a divine scapegoat. And if you don't do that, then you can have a mortal scapegoat, and that's what we're witnessing here with the New American Awakening. One mortal scapegoat after another.
You talk a lot in your discussion, especially about woke capitalism, with the idea
If you could speak up just a bit.
Yeah. So you talk in your discussion about the idea that woke capitalism is a way of justifying existing power structures and using this as a symbolic means of covering that up. So how destructive, or what are the destructive effects of this ideology if it's not undermining these existing power structures and just covering them over?
I'm still not literally able to hear the question.
Okay. How destructive, or what are the destructive effects of this ideology if it's largely serving to symbolically cover over the existing power dynamics that exist?
Okay, now I understand. So look, I'm with Tocqueville, and what I mean, he's a French Anglophile who had great admiration for market commerce, but knew there were limits to it, because that's where I stand. So, but having said that, I will now, in a way, defend free market commerce. Not as a purist, not as a libertarian, but with the understanding that commerce is really important. The problem is you can't have economies of scale. You've got to have competition where people can break into a market. And the problem is, by any measure, what we have now is nothing like market commerce. You've got a global corporatism, permanent winners and permanent losers. You can't build a world on that. You'll build a world of permanent winners and permanent losers that way. But you can't build a world where the entrepreneurial spirit can thrive and we can come up with whole new technology. You can't do that. So it's not just BlackRock, it's all the high-tech companies, right? They buy their innocence by banning Trump or by shifting people's news feeds so that it appears that Apple's woke. And this is the problem, is that they're buying a way out of scrutiny, which they need to have. So if you cover yourself with innocence, the scrutiny that would normally come your way is bypassed, and that's what they figured out.
From Matthew Neufeld, he wants to know, if the churches do not succeed in reclaiming the domain of guilt and innocence, what are the prospects of avoiding a secularized sacrificial crisis or a civil conflict?
So I said the churches have to save us, but here I think are the three real alternatives before us. One, the one I just said, which is that the idea of transgression and innocence return to their theological home, and then we have the rich tradition and understanding within Christianity about how we atone. Two, we continue on this way with the burden of guilt getting greater and greater and greater, and people making sacrifices they wouldn't otherwise make. So the burden of guilt gets so heavy, well, maybe it's okay if I tear down all the monuments. Maybe it's okay if we destroy the idea of the American founders. Maybe it's okay if we destroy the conventional family. Maybe it's okay because I'm desperately searching for guilt or ways to atone for my guilt. I think that can only go so far, because there'll be real ramifications of this when the family gets undermined, when the nation gets undermined, when our history gets undermined. You can't build a world on that kind of chaos. So I don't think that one's going to work either. So here's the third one. It's the one I most fear. It's the alt-right. Because Nietzsche's answer to the question, how we shall have a tomorrow, was not through atonement, repentance, and forgiveness. It was that we will forget. He calls for that. So American slavery, who cares? Colonialism, 2 world wars, the Holocaust, it's all right. That was then. That's the world I'm most worried about. Because when the burden of guilt gets so heavy, people will say, I'm done. And this is happening in America and in Europe right now. A younger generation, largely of men, are saying, I can't bear this weight anymore. I'm tired of this irredeemable stain that's been painted on me that I can't obviate. I'm done. I don't care. And that's my biggest fear. This is why I want to push it back into the Christian category. Because then we can have a reckoning with history, not as collective guilt, but as collective responsibility. Don't forget the distinction. If wounds have been caused, then I don't care where you came from. If you're here in America, let's do what we can to constructively heal wounds, okay? None of the innocent signaling that buys you a way out and then you can sit on your couch and think everything's fine. No, that's in fact my biggest objection to identity politics, is that it does nothing. So if there's a wound that's come from some historical events, slavery in America, yeah, there are repercussions of that. And let's try and figure out constructively how to do that. But what I'm most worried about is the alt-right. Because when you give people guilt, when you say guilt is on your shoulders and there's no way out, you're asking for real trouble. And that's where we are right now.
Another online question. Why do you think the church has failed to recognize the perversions of its own categories? And is it possible for the church to go about restoring truth?
I don't know. So I trace this to Nietzsche's diagnosis that the fate was going to be that Christianity was going to wither. And I think Dan's account, which goes back further to Auguste Comte, is a powerful one. I trace it, you'll not be surprised, back to Augustine's distinction between the city of man and the city of God. What's the great temptation in human life? The belief that we can build a world around ourselves, that we can live in the city of man. The city of man is all that we need. And Augustine saw this in the city of God. Read the book. He saw these were the 2 great temptations, right? So it's a problem inscribed into our psyches itself. It's the revolt against God, the belief that we can live this way. So then what brings us back? And here, I will say that my favorite fable from the New Testament is the story of the prodigal son. The son leaves his father. Well, we know what that means theologically. And he goes off to make his way on his own, and for a while he's okay. And then he gets hungrier and hungrier and hungrier. And he doesn't go back. He ends up on a farm. He ends up in the pigsty, eating pig corn. Oh, but wait, no, it's more brilliant than that. He eats the pig corn, it's not nourishing, and then there's no pig corn left, and he feasts on the husks of the corn. You know what that means? That means we're going to try this and keep pushing it as far as we possibly can until we realize there's no nourishment left. And maybe at that point, and I don't know whether that's 10 years or 50 years or 100 years, maybe at that point we realize we have to turn back to the treasure.
What would it mean if the second option happens, and how would that affect other countries that aren't Europe and America? Like, what should we save from America and give to the next countries that are embracing Christianity and its true definitions?
Well, so this is a big battle. So in Africa, for example, there are a lot of serious Christians, and they get very nervous when the American State Department insists that a certain agenda is going to be promulgated. I don't know what the answer is to this. So look, there were two kinds of universalisms in the last 20 years. There was the neoliberal one, which was based on making the world conform to the norms of the liberal international order, which was largely this new awakening. And then there was the neoconservative one, which sought to do something of the same thing, but through military force. But they're two universalisms. And while the neoconservative one seems to be discredited now, because I think Americans aren't really ready for war, the neoliberal one is still going full force. And you'll see it in the Biden administration. It's already been announced about hanging certain flags in State Department or in embassies around the world. And I think a lot of Christians around the world are looking at us with great incredulity. I'm not sure what to do. Part of the reason I'm a believer not in universalism but in pluralism is because I don't think America should have this huge footprint which imposes on countries either militarily or through pressures of norms a certain vision of how the world should be. My view is it's a very Tocquevillian one. He said in 1830, variety is disappearing from the human race. 1835, he said that. And that's what's happening today. And my view is we have to have pluralism and that we shouldn't be telling other nations of the world how to live.
Thank you so much for speaking today. You talked a little bit about cathartic rage versus rational conversation. And when engaging people who are fully adhering to this idea of this new secular Great Awakening, who should this rage be directed towards in engaging conversation when talking to someone who would not agree that the scapegoat should be Christ?
This is a huge issue. That's why I said husband is set against wife and sister set against brother. I mean, this is happening in families, is that communication is completely breaking down because certain members of the family are so livid that you can't even say anything without them completely blowing up. And as I said at the outset, look, I live out on a farm. I don't live in a gold palace and I don't golf. So there are a lot of things about Trump that I don't like, but it's one thing to say, okay, I don't like these things, but it's another to have him be the object of cathartic rage. And I don't have an answer to it except I simply don't go to that place where this can happen. And that's why we have these two conversations in America right now. There's one conversation where even if you don't like Trump, you can at least have a conversation about him. Well, I liked his policy about China, but not that. You can have that conversation, but there's another group where you can't even do that. And as I said, it's beyond, political polarization doesn't capture it. It's the problem of cathartic rage. It's ultimately a religious problem about where the scapegoat lies. And frankly, and you've pointed the answer, the only way out of this is if we can turn and realize that we're not going to solve the problem of our impurity by venting cathartic rage on another person. This was the pagan understanding. Okay? And especially in America, you can't do that. The only reason America can ever work is if we have an understanding that you can't vent your cathartic rage on another group. That's the only way you have a multiracial, multi-ethnic community, is that you're able to see that there's something more. And if you're driven by cathartic rage, you can't see that there's something more. That's why, I think is it Galatians or Ephesians? I always get the two confused. There will be neither Jew nor Gentile, man nor woman, freed nor slave, in Christ. But if you don't have that in Christ part, then there are going to be all these distinctions, right? And Reinhold Niebuhr, by the way, was very good on this. Nobody reads him anymore, but he said, there isn't a natural love of one group toward another. That has to be, that's a divine thing. To be able to see past mortal distinctions, that's a divine thing. Okay? Which is why it's utterly naive on the part of the secularists to say that naturally we should embrace others. No, that's not true. Naturally we circle around our own. And it's only by the break-in of something divine that we're able to move beyond that. We have to get this. Even Nietzsche, who I said I'm always nervous about, he said, prejudice is to dislike a person more than they deserve to be disliked. Dislike a group more than they... he's saying groups should dislike each other. We can't think that way, but we have to see what the baseline is. And I think this analysis of cathartic rage, of a group self-enclosure, that's the baseline, people. Stop with the idealism and then say if you don't embrace groups without reference to God, there's something wrong with you. No, what the ancients knew, certainly what Christianity knew, was that it's natural to focus in on a group, and that if you're going to do more than that, it's a divine gift. It's mercy. There's a way to see beyond groups, but it's not a mortal way. Something has to break in from above.